All right, I'll kick it over to Jeff for this next part.
Jeff?
Jeff, are you there?
All right.
I think...
Hey, Jeff, I think you're on mute.
Hey, welcome everyone. I'm Engel with CompuNet. Excited to have you here with You're on Mute. Joined today by Mike.
Thanks, Rainer. I'm Mike Bullough. I'm a principal engineer on our data center team with CompuNet out of our Boise, Idaho office. So I've been at CompuNet about 5 years now, and I think we're here today to talk about hypervisors.
Yeah, thanks. Yeah, so I've been with CompuNet 13 years. We have an amazing data center team. It's been a great team. Lots of crazy stuff happening out in the market now, right? With the hypervisors.
To say the least.
So tell me a little bit, let's go back a little bit maybe. Talk a little bit about Broadcom and some of the changes and what you've seen in the market.
Sure. Yeah. Well, I think, when people talk about the new normal in the hypervisor market, I mean, it's the elephant in the room there is the Broadcom acquisition of VMware, which we're about almost 2 years into now. But I think to understand the story of kind of, what brought us to today is to kind of, look at what the market looked like before the Broadcom acquisition of VMware. So prior to Broadcom acquiring VMware, really in technology, we look at, what we call tech domains, right? So when we talk about VMware, right, VMware was the name of the company, right? And their primary product was their hypervisor, which kind of they fell under the umbrella with them of their vSphere product, which was their ESXi hypervisor, which prior to the Broadcom acquisition accounted for roughly 85% of the on-prem hypervisor market. I don't know what the threshold for, kind of owning a monopoly in a space is, but I mean, they really own the space, right? There was really no competitors.
And they're great at it.
Yeah, and they're great at it. But when you're a tech company and you sell a product with software, you'd think that owning 85% of a market was a good problem to have. But VMware was also a publicly traded company, right? So you can run into a problem when you're too successful. They own 85% of the market. How do they grow? Where are their other customers, right? So that was a problem for VMware prior to the Broadcom acquisition. I think they had a little bit of a Alexander the Great moment where they kind of stood on a hillside and, wept because there were no more kingdoms to conquer, no more customers to get. So at one of the VMware Explore conferences in Las Vegas prior to the acquisition, I actually had a conversation with one of the VMware sales reps where, she really said, if we're still talking about what people are doing with their hypervisor, we're having the wrong conversations. Because, internally at VMware, they were really struggling, I think, to get people to adopt their other, like their expanded portfolio of products, right? Because at VMware, again, everybody owned VMware from a hypervisor standpoint, but they didn't own kind of the add-ons, right? The do you want fries with that? It was the NSX features for network security, the ARIA for automation, Cloud Ops, all these different other pieces and components that kind of comprise their portfolio. That, honestly, they were having a hard time getting customers to adopt, right? Because, the customers had what they had, they were consuming the product, it was working well, everybody was happy, it was kind of status quo. Well, Broadcom came in and acquired VMware. They kind of saw, they're not stupid, right? They did their due diligence, they evaluated, they knew what they were buying, they knew the challenges that VMware had inside the company. And a lot of this is conjecture on my part, right? Obviously, I never worked there, and I never had a lot of inside knowledge, but based off conversations I've had with them and just what I saw and knew the industry was doing, this is kind of my opinion on the whole situation. So they came in and acquired the product, and decided their go-to-market strategy was going to include product bundling, subscription-based services, moving away from perpetual licenses, which I don't think really surprised anybody, because those were already steps that VMware was making prior to the acquisition. You know, a lot of people forget that prior to Broadcom buying them, VMware had already adopted a subscription-based model. That's where they were already pushing all their customers, not as aggressively as Broadcom did when they came in and actually, you know, finalized the purchase, but it was already in the works. You know, I think it was the other go-to-market strategies that Broadcom had that, you know, I think there was, in my opinion, there were some stumbles and some missteps, which I think caused some reputational damage. You know, with the product, definitely damaged trust, you know, for the greater customer base that they had out there. And really what that did is that made people stop and say, okay, well, what other options are there? You know, where do we go from here? Do we stay with VMware? You know, but it really, for the first time in, you know, for as long as I can remember, people really stopped and said, is this the right product? I mean, that just wasn't a conversation that people had pertaining to VMware up till this point.
So there were a lot of other products, right, out there.
Sure.
And to your point, they weren't in the spotlight, right? To your point, VMware, great product, right? Dominated the market. So now you have some of these changes and people are reevaluating. So what'd you see pop up in the spotlight? What are some of the products you've seen out there?
Well, you know, there are a lot of the legacy products that have been around for a really long time. Again, these are products that were, you know, that were options prior again to the Broadcom acquisition that just, you know, didn't really have the market share because there was a clear winner, right? That was VMware. So a lot of those products, you know, Microsoft has obviously been a strong player in the field for a really long time with their Hyper-V product. But Microsoft is kind of an interesting one to look at because, you know, Hyper-V from an on-prem perspective has been around for, I mean, as long or longer than VMware has really. I mean, not longer, but they've been there just kind of along the journey with them every step of the way. But Microsoft shifted their focus some time ago, kind of away from their on-prem products and really became laser focused on their cloud initiatives, their Microsoft 365, Microsoft Azure, you know, again, kind of the products that fit under that portfolio. That's just where they, you know, they to their credit, they became very laser focused, you know, in those areas. They really kind of stopped the R&D in a lot of their on-prem products. I shouldn't say stop it, maybe, you know, realign priorities, you know, whereas, you know, for a really long time, Microsoft kind of owned that on-prem server infrastructure world. And, you know, when they started to make their journey into the cloud, they never really looked back, right? So
we see a lot of that, right?
Sure.
The
Absolutely.
cloud, subscription,
Cloud.
you
Yeah.
mentioned earlier, consumption, right? That's a big way things are changing. So, all right, so they're investing a little bit. They're shifting their investment more into the cloud. What are you seeing there?
Yeah. So again, you know, so when all of when the Broadcom acquisition of VMware happened, we actually, you know, at CompuNet brought in some of the, you know, our partners from Microsoft and sat down with them and we asked, you know, so what is Microsoft's plan for this, right? I mean, does Microsoft have a plan to recapture some of this on-prem hypervisor market that they really kind of neglected a little bit with you know, letting Hyper-V kind of stagnate a little bit from an on-prem standpoint, you know, and it kind of surprised us a little bit because Microsoft's messaging was, you know, that, you know, Microsoft Hyper-V in its current state is never going away, right? Because Hyper-V is still the underpinning foundational technology that all of Azure runs on. But they kind of alluded to the fact, like, if you're holding your breath for, you know, Hyper-V to, you know, on-prem to become something that's, you know, significantly different than what it is today, like, maybe don't do that. That's not really a great, you know, option for you. They were very clear that their strategic direction to move forward is Azure, their cloud services. Now, that being said, Microsoft has put a lot of money in recent history into some kind of hybrid on-prem, hybrid cloud products. Azure Local being one of them, which is kind of an evolution of what they call their Azure Stack solution. So that's a viable option. Again, when customers are looking at today what's out there, you know, it's a bigger conversation. You know, it goes beyond, what are the direct competitors to what VMware can do, right? Because what we've been advocating at CompuNet for our customer base when we get asked this question, and believe me, we get asked this question 20 times a day from customers. It's all anybody wants to talk about is, really it's just where do we go from here? And our messaging with that has been the same today that it's been prior to the Broadcom acquisition as well. It depends. We need to take a step back and we need to do a real evaluation of your environment. We need to take a look at what you're doing with your technology, where you're spending your money, and really what it comes down to at the end of the day is what business value are you really getting out of this investment in technology, right? What business problem are we solving? Because at CompuNet and as IT individuals, sometimes it's hard for us to lose focus and I guess maybe take for granted the reality that, our core business competency at CompuNet is technology, right? But that's not always the case for our customers, right? We have customers in healthcare where their core business competency is providing healthcare, right? So for them, when they invest money in technology, they're trying to make their operations and make them better at their core business competency, right? That's why they spend money on technology.
So we're looking to make sure, again, we're solving their business solutions, which to your point, in different avenues and all. And again, when we look at the hypervisors, there's a lot out there. It's a lot of different options. Some have bubbled up. And then kind of one of the things you said too is we look at their, call it workload or their business case and all. We've also seen hybrid solutions, right? Where they're using maybe part of one and part of another because this workload or this area that can use, say, Hyper-V to your point, which may not be heavily invested in, but maybe tier one production will go a different way. Do you see that a little bit too?
Oh, all the time. I mean, and that was again, our industry is kind of plagued with the curse of buzzwords, right? So we all remember when the cloud, right? It was the cloud. All anybody could ever talk about is cloud. Now the industry buzzword it's AI everything. There is a new buzzword that companies like, that Broadcom are using, and that's the private cloud, right? Where they're basically, one of the benefits of, companies that decided to do kind of a wholesale lift and shift of their environment up to like the Azures and the AWSs of the world was really the benefit that the cloud brought to organizations just in general was flexibility was a big one, right? I mean, you could scale it up or down very rapidly depending on, what the workload was, what the load on the workload was. I remember when Domino's did their when they kind of reinvented their platform and did the big launch, they partnered with one of the big hyperscalers, and for them, they had to. I remember they were talking about how they had to accommodate for huge bursts of traffic during certain times, and they could predict it relatively accurately, right? Dinner time, lunchtime, right? Super Bowl football's on, right? I mean, they could kind of graph and trend when their systems were going to get a huge burden put on them, and that's really what some of the value that the public cloud could bring, right? Is they could scale up their environment really rapidly and throw tons more compute and network resources at their applications when they needed it, and then shrink it back down when they didn't. So they could control their costs that way. Whereas if you built out a data center yourself, if your peak traffic was up here, well, that's what you had to account for all the time, and that's where you had to, your investment had to account for peak traffic workload. So there was a lot of that flexibility that came into play. So a lot of those lessons that got learned during kind of that cloud evolution, that was one of the big conversations. That was one of the first places people went is, should we move to the cloud, right? We have this environment on-prem. Should we move it to the cloud? As we're going through this hypervisor evaluation process. And again, we've had a pretty similar talk track to customers that have wanted to move to the cloud for years, right? Because even prior to the Broadcom acquisition, this is something that customers do occasionally. They come to us and they say, hey, we have all this, server and, all the server infrastructure, all this network infrastructure, all these IT investments on-prem, it's aging out. Do we replace it or do we move to the cloud? And again, our strategy today isn't much different than it was 5 years ago with that, where we say, okay, we need to evaluate what we're doing, right? It starts with an evaluation of what you're doing on-prem. Again, what those business applications are. We go down into the VM level and say, okay, what's this VM doing? What's this VM doing? What application are we hosting here? And generally, the result of that is we look at those customers that wanted to maybe evaluate that. Do we go to the cloud journey? Is we say, well, let's evaluate your applications. And usually the cloud migrations and cloud initiatives that we support and our advice on those is, well, is there, like, you're doing this thing with this application, with these sets of servers in your environment, is there a SaaS, software as a service, equivalent to that? A great example to that is, for the last 10 years, we've been migrating people's on-prem Microsoft Exchange servers up to Microsoft Office 365, which is the software as a service or SaaS solution for that product. Well, that made sense for everybody. I mean, we had a lot of success in doing that, and customers found a lot more value instead of hosting that server infrastructure that was required to host that email application, right? We kind of we got rid of those servers on-prem and offloaded that up to just a recurring SaaS application. Well, what else can we do that for in your environment? So that's usually step one where we start there. And this has been no different, because with customers looking at, where do they want to go with their hypervisor? It's, well, let's get smarter with your environment in general. Let's take a look at everything. Nothing's off limits. Let's really look into, where you're spending your dollars here. What makes sense to go to a software as a service application? What do you really need to keep on-prem? And different industries are just different for that, right? I mean, there's data sovereignty concerns. If organizations are international, there's just different considerations for that. Are you a governmental organization that needs to adhere to certain security standards, or are you just a mom and pop shop that's been in business for 50 years and you've just always had the same, you're doing today with technology because it's what you've always done, right? You've had your neighbor's your IT guy, and you have your server in your closet, and this is just what we've always done. We've always had VMware on it. Then, this has given us, I think, one of the silver linings of the Broadcom acquisition of VMware is it's forced people to take a step back and say, are we really making the correct decisions with our investment in technology?
Let's talk about that technology, right? So there's, let's talk on-prem. You talked some cloud options.
Mm-hmm.
We talked Hyper-V, which again, we talked about Microsoft kind of wants to invest more in the cloud. But, again, things that have popped up, we've had Nutanix out there, right? As
Mm-hmm.
a converged technology. And then, you've got Dell and Cisco and Pure and some of those that have had that 3-tiered approach.
Mm-hmm.
But recently we've had some announcements with them kind of partnering together, right? Tell me a little bit more about what you've seen there.
Yeah, there's been some really interesting evolutions with some legacy vendors that I never thought I would see. I mean, I guess in general, I never thought I would see as many people migrating, again, to your point, back to Hyper-V, right? That's something I never thought I would see in a million years. If you were to ask me 5 years ago that, we were going to come to a day where we were going to see people migrating to Hyper-V, I'd been like, you're crazy. That's just not going to happen. Another area of that is one of the other big players in the industry has been Nutanix. And yeah, that's so that there's, I mean, I'm trying to not throw around too many buzzwords here, but there's the kind of the two-pronged, the two major camps for hosting your on-prem virtual environments. There's what we've kind of considered the 3-tier or converged architecture, and that's where you have your servers that don't have any local storage in them, right? They have the CPU, the memory, the network, but your storage is on a separate appliance or array, and that could be, again, a Pure Storage, NetApp, Dell, HP. There's a lot of different flavors of that out there, and the benefit of that is you can kind of scale. If you need more storage, you just add more,
Right.
like another storage shelf. If you need more compute, you add more servers with just, CPU. If you need more memory, you do that. The other side of that coin has been what they call the HCI or hyper converged. And that's where there's a lot of really what have been kind of niche vendors out there. Like, I'm not saying Nutanix is niche, but the theory of that is it's kind of an all-in-one appliance. So really, to go with a Nutanix, environment, you had to really adopt that hyper-converged or HCI architecture in your data center. So basically what that was is, you had servers they all had CPU, memory, network, and storage in them. So
if you invest it in storage somewhere else, didn't matter.
Yeah, you couldn't really mix and match. It was really one or the other. And there's pros and cons for each, right? Each have their place, each have their use case. There are certain technologies where hyper converged or HCI environments work fantastic. Those environments generally are for when you have a workload that's predictably scalable. You can scale up your environment to fit that need, right? So there has to be kind of a predictable curve on your growth curve. Where it doesn't work too good is like, when you just have just general compute environments, right? Because stuff just grows in unpredictable ways, and like you need to expand memory, but you don't need to expand CPU or hard drive. It's like you have to, with HCI, you just have to do everything all at the same time, right? How you expand is you just add another server, but that server has to be basically a matching configuration of all the others. So you just kept adding nodes. So that was Nutanix, right? And that was their whole market or go-to-market strategy. Is they were all in on HCI. They did not have a solution that supported a 3-tier or converged architecture. But again, with the kind of with the shakeup and with all the the industry out there basically kind of looking at to these companies and begging them for alternatives. The Nutanix got together with Cisco and Pure Storage. And there's an upcoming and expected release of a version of their software that will work on a 3-tier architecture, which again was something that has been completely contrary to their business model since really the inception of the company.
Right, to work with Dell or Pure.
Yeah,
or
they were not.
Cisco.
They were not interested.
So they wanted to sell a box. The box would have compute. It would have storage, memory. You would add it on. It would just kind of step up.
Mm-hmm.
But if you had things on the side, you couldn't integrate it in there. If you wanted extra storage, you were buying compute and everything else as you add it. So this is a big change, right? This announcement, the partnerships, like we said, Pure and Cisco and Dell. Yeah. We're now basically, you can utilize things that you've invested in.
Yeah, exactly. And I think that's really where a lot of the, again, the desire that customers, that we're seeing our customers come to us with is, they, again, and you use the word investment. And I think that's really the key to the issue is, a lot of these organizations have made huge investments, millions of dollars in technology investments in a certain type of architecture to work with a certain type of system. And now the calculus is changing a little bit on, what the real value of that is based on, again, uncertainty, not only in, what their cost structure is going to look like with, new licensing models from vendors, but again, just, do the business practices and the go-to-market strategies of these technology vendors a la Broadcom, do these really line up with what organizations are looking for when they partner with companies? Because again, people like choice. Organizations like choice, right? When we go to a car lot, we like to be able to say, I like that car, but the color sucks. I like the wheels on this one. I like this one. And we like to have choice. If we all went to a car lot and it was the same, light gray Ford Focus that, okay, well, I guess that's my option, right? And that's kind of the way people feel with Broadcom now, right? Because they really eliminated the choice. They said here's the platform, take it or leave it, right? There is no more choice. You don't get a choice in color. You don't get a choice in sizing. It is a very strange go-to-market strategy that kind of goes against everything we know consumers enjoy, right? And we can know that in our own lives, right? We look at, again, we're consumers in everything we do. So what do we like? We like choice. That's not available anymore. So I think a lot of these organizations like the Nutanix of the world, like the Hewlett Packards, the HPEs of the world are seeing is there is this vacuum in the market right now that really was created by customers just not my honest opinion of it is Broadcom just basically lost the trust of all of their consumers. People just don't trust them anymore.
Go back 1 second there. You talked about HPE, and we're talking about some of the other options there. Tell me a little bit. I know you've looked into, I think HPE acquired Morpheus, and tell me a little bit more about that.
Yeah, that's one of the more interesting solutions that's kind of popped up recently, and it came from a pretty unexpected source in HPE. So, HPE has a little bit of a reputation of, they have been growing through acquisition for quite some time now. There's a lot of companies out there, a lot of the HP portfolio of products today, and let me be very clear, I need HPE, HP Enterprise, because they made kind of a fork of the two brands years ago. But yeah, HPE, like Nimble Storage is a good example, right? Nimble was a pretty was one of the market leading storage brands out there that HPE acquired.
Yep.
And they've since integrated that into their portfolio. Zerto is another great example, great replication software that HP purchased and is now part of their portfolio. So that's
Juniper.
Juniper. Yep. It will maybe,
Huge.
yeah.
Huge acquisitions,
that one's going to be huge. So one of the acquisitions that HP made, actually closed in August of 2024 was they acquired a company called Morpheus Data. For those listening that don't know who Morpheus Data was, they were a big player in the industry, and really they were, kind of, and I don't really know, there's not really a good term for it because they really had a kind of a unique platform. So if you were a large enterprise that had, you had maybe some VMware infrastructure in one data center, you had some Hyper-V infrastructure in another data center, maybe you had some Nutanix over there in the corner, you had a bunch of workloads up in AWS, you had a bunch of workloads up in Azure, and Morpheus Data was a platform that that you would kind of put over top of all of those various infrastructures, and you could start managing and controlling and monitoring those infrastructures with kind of a single policy sets, just kind of manage and monitor from a single pane of glass. So it was really a multiple platform orchestration and management software. So HP acquired them. The deal closed in August of 2024. And after the deal closed, HP started digging into the kind of their code base, their internal projects that they were working on. And they kind of stumbled across this product that Morpheus had called VM Essentials. And effectively what it was it was an open source, you leveraging a lot of various open source technologies. It was a one-to-one kind of replacement for what VMware was, KVM based hypervisor. Again, the KVM based hypervisors, that's the same underpinning technology that Nutanix uses. It's the same underpinning technology that Proxmox uses. Really, any of the open source or Linux-based hypervisors out there are a KVM-based hypervisor. So they started asking some of the Morpheus folks. They're like, well, we didn't really even know you guys had this. And they're like, oh yeah, it's just kind of a pet project we've been working on for the last 5 years or something. It's yours now. Go nuts. And HP kind of, they really started looking into what they had with that Morpheus VM Essentials product. And they're like, wow, we really have something here. And as they started digging into it more and more, they realized that it could be an actual viable go-to-market one-to-one, VMware replacement hypervisor. So since then, HP has put a ton of R&D into this platform. And it is available to purchase today for customers. There are a lot of large enterprises that are actually adopting the software. We have a ton of customers that are very interested in evaluating it, that are currently evaluating it now. We have a lot of customers that are doing proof of concept, kind of POCs in their environment where we're helping them set up, a Morpheus environment, alongside their VMware environment so that they can kind of do the testing and see, if it's going to be a viable solution for them. It's still a little bit early in the development cycle of it, and we are waiting for a couple things before it's what we would consider before we're recommending customers do full-scale production migrations. Chiefly among those is there are some backup vendors like the Veeams and the Cohesities and the Rubrics out there that are rapidly working on adding support into their platforms for some of these other hypervisors, because then their customer bases are just begging them to get support for a wider array of these hypervisors. but yeah, that one's going to be really interesting. There's a couple products out there um, that are sticking with I'm going to call it the legacy licensing model of the per socket based licenses versus the per core license. And that was one of the, I think, that was one of the pebbles in the shoe of a lot of customers that were traditional VMware customers is, Broadcom, VMware's decision. And again, this was a decision that was made prior to Broadcom. So this isn't on Broadcom. This is kind of an industry thing. But Nutanix and both VMware moved to a per core licensing model versus a per socket, which they did that because, mostly when you look at like what Intel and AMD have done over the years, right? Back in the day, you'd get like 2 8-core processors in your server, and that was kind of that was all the horsepower that you could really get out of these servers. Today, you can get 64 cores out of a single socket, right? So they were looking at that, and people were they just needed fewer sockets to host the same type of the same number of workloads. So financially, it was more beneficial for these hypervisor companies to migrate to a per core model versus socket.
So let's talk about this for a second. So we've talked about a bunch of different options, and there's still a bunch. Red Hat, right? I heard you mention Proxmox. There's a bunch of different options out there. But one of the challenges I guess everyone's probably asking is, okay, I've got this environment. How do I move to it? What's the complexity? Like, kind of help me through that.
Yeah, and that's where it's different in every case. There are
complex, hard. Is it?
So for the customers that we've seen that have actually migrated their production environments and actually said, okay, we're moving away. Migrations are not as hard as people think they are, right? There's I think people have a lot more anxiety and think they're going to be a lot more difficult than they are. But, at the end of the day, the customers that we've helped actually do migrations away from their, legacy hypervisor platform to, what they consider to be their next generation platform, it's actually been pretty easy.
Okay.
There hasn't been as much struggle in it. And I would say that's mostly due with we put a big emphasis on planning and testing ahead of time. That is huge. Planning and testing is huge. There's also the retooling and retraining your staff, right? Because if you have a lot of these companies have administrators that have been working at their organization for a really long time that have been their skill set is in VMware, right? That's where again, I mean, our core competency at CompuNet, right? We have such an unbelievably deep bench of VMware technical experts, that now we're kind of, we're retraining and relearning and becoming experts on other platforms, mostly because, again, it's not because we think of VMware as a bad solution. It's still a fantastic solution. And at the end of a lot of these evaluations that we do, more often than not, our advice to customers is, VMware's probably, looks like VMware's still the most viable option for you. But for the customers that decide to go elsewhere, again, we're in the same boat that their administrators are, which is we just need to learn new platforms, learn new technologies. But a migration to a Nutanix, a Proxmox, an HP VME, a Hyper-V, it's always a different process. There's different caveats that go into it. And again, the key to the success of all of those is just testing, training, and planning. Those are really the big three key pillars. And as long as you just do a thorough job of all three of those, you're going to be fine.
So the big thing that I'm hearing here, right? Like every company is going to be different, and CompuNet's here to help, right? And to understand basically what they need, look at the different loads, right? The different products, help move them through it. And you and I talked about this earlier. Help move them through it. We're all kind of be there learning at the same time, right? Help educate their team, help their team feel comfortable with whatever solution they go through. So you just said it, right? Evaluation, testing, and we test a lot of these different products, whether it's from the backup solutions that we could use to transfer, whether it's some of the alternative hypervisors out there, and all the way to when it's installed, it's in place, making sure they feel comfortable. Because let's face it, none of us like changes. We like to stay with what we know, and we don't want to necessarily change, it throws a wrench into a whole bunch of things.
Yeah, and I think for me at least, that's one of the reasons why I again enjoy one of the things I enjoy the most about working at CompuNet is philosophically, myself being a consultant prior to coming over to CompuNet, is that was one of the areas where I really tried to philosophically keep myself in this industry. And it can be hard sometimes, and that's to put yourself on the customer side of the table and not the vendor side of the table. So when we're doing these evaluations with our customers, not only from a hypervisor standpoint, but I mean, our network teams do this from routing and switching and security products. And, we have dedicated cloud teams that try to do this. Again, it's the same methodology that we bring to, okay, let's look at your hypervisors. Let's look what we're doing there that we bring to everything we do. And that's, we sit down with our customers and we say, okay, let's take a step back and let's evaluate, let's ask why we're doing what we're doing, because a lot of times when we go in and talk to new customers, especially, we see that they're making a lot of their technology decisions and a lot of their dollars are being spent in areas just based off of momentum, right? They're doing this today because this is what they've always done, right? And that nobody's stepped in and said, okay, let's stop, let's take a step back and say why, right? So again, at CompuNet, we at least, again, one of the things I enjoy about working at CompuNet is I feel like I have the freedom to be vendor agnostic in these conversations. So when we sit down with our customers and we say, okay, let's look at this, we're not going into it with kind of a confirmation bias of like, this is the company this is the vendor, that the technology that I'm going to sell you because I get the most spiffs from
Right
them,
solution for
we get the
what
most
they need.
kickbacks. Yeah, it's, again, because that's the thing. I mean, maybe VMware is the right answer, right? Maybe our customers need to stay there. If that's so great, if that's what's in our customers' best interest, we're not gonna hesitate to tell you that. But if it's in our customers' best interest, after we do an evaluation and after we look at these other solutions, maybe it aligns more with their business goals, maybe it aligns more closely with their budget and where they're wanting to spend their money. That's going to be the recommendation that we're going to make. And again, we try to make that recommendation, again, sitting on our customer side of the table, where we're sitting alongside our customers, evaluating these technologies, these solutions. We're really doing this evaluation together, and looking at all these different vendors and technologies. Because I mean, again, we've all seen, when we go to tech events, there's kind of what we call the NASCAR slides, right? You go in and there's a poster and there's 400 different technology vendor logos up there. And it's like, well, okay, they all kind of roughly do the same thing. Which one should I be spending money on? And that's where it comes down to, well, yeah, they're all going to, when you put the Venn diagram up of all of these different vendors, we're going to have like 90% overlap. If we're looking at, hypervisors doing this one thing, it's going to be that 10%, the 10% that they all do differently, that is going to matter the most for our customers. But making those decisions are going to have long-term ramifications, right? Because again, migrations aren't cheap. They're never cheap. In the hypervisor space, in the network space, in the cloud space, whatever space it is in technology, when you choose a new platform, there is a cost, there is a pain, there is a business disruption in migrating to something new. And we want to make sure that when we do migrate to that something new, we're not going to get to the end of that road and go, crap, we chose wrong, and have to migrate again, because that's worst case scenario.
So one of the things I also think is important, you just talked about it, like going into the unknown. We actually have all these solutions. We're either in process, they're in place, we're testing them. You've been working with the Morpheus product. We have Nutanix. We actually also make sure, and again, I think that's one of the important things. Look, we understand. We want to make sure that we've kind of stepped through it already. We had a conversation about a week ago with the engineers. They want the physical hardware. I want to know what it looks like. I want to play with the software so that if there's any gotchas that we know, right? We're agnostic. We're trying to find the right solution. And that being said, the only way we can do that is by trying these all out. And I think another important thing to talk about is you mentioned something about domains. I mean, right now we're sitting here. This is more of a data center conversation, but we have a cybersecurity team. We have our enterprise networking. And you know this in our calls. We've been trying to bring those domains closer. Why? You can't do anything without cybersecurity. You can't do anything without the enterprise networking. They're that important. And I think it's important to know that we're not sitting here not just in a vacuum. We're testing these products. We're talking to the cybersecurity team, right? This is all encompassing That's what we do as consultants and engineers for CompuNet.
Yeah, and modern technology solutions specifically. I mean, that's solutions have been getting more and more integrated as the years have gone on. Again, there used to be there's a term of like a waffle solution and a spaghetti solution out there for technology that I like to use. It's a good analogy for customers where, for a long time, and you still see this a lot in large enterprise IT departments, right? It's like you have your storage admin, and that's all he does is he works on storage, right? It's like, well, do you do anything with the servers? He's like, nope, I'm storage. That's all I am, right? Well, that's kind of that's really the way of looking at technology, like a waffle, right? Each square completely independent. You can fill up each little square with its own amount of syrup and butter and make, whatever you want to do. They're completely
making me
separate.
hungry, Mike.
Yeah. Most of my analogies are food based, but modern technology solutions, again, they're more like spaghetti, right? Everything's touching everything, right? You can't really separate any of these technologies anymore without a cybersecurity component touching it somewhere. You can't really take your hypervisor solution and not talk about cybersecurity or AI implications or okay, yes, we're going to make this decision here, but how is that going to affect my core networking stack in the data center, and how are we logging all of this? Is it compatible with our SIM? Are the support contracts the same, right? It's all encompassing, all touching each other. So that's again where that methodology of, okay, let's evaluate, right? Let's spend more time on the evaluation process and really getting down into the nitty gritty, getting down into the details of, okay, we're thinking about making this change. Now let's start having kind of let's go through the mental exercise of what else is this going to impact and affect. And what you'll always realize is all technology solutions are now spaghetti solutions. Everything touches everything. They can't be looked at in vacuums anymore. It has to be looked at from an all-encompassing strategic level. And if you don't do that, it's not going to be as successful, in my opinion.
Agreed. Well, I look forward to more conversations and further digging into things as we see them. So,
Same
Mike,
here.
Yeah, thanks for your time today.
Yeah, my pleasure. Thanks for having me.
All right. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, guys.